Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 22nd of June, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. And we will start with you with a massive missile strike and a drone strike on the territory of Ukraine. A map of approximate flight routes of Russian missiles, cruise missiles and drones has already been published. As you can see, based on the information, ballistics were not used at night. Basically, the Ha-100 and the 1st, 555th, and the disembodied Shahids themselves were used. We see with you from the main routes, all the strikes fell on western Ukraine, although there are several strikes in the central part. While it is difficult to say exactly what was hit, what was specifically destroyed, but one thing is unequivocally clear. It is clear that the energy infrastructure facilities were the current goal of the Russian Federation. There are no frames, there are no pictures confirming the strikes on energy infrastructure facilities, but there are satellite images. To be more precise, there are, let's say, pictures of fiery anomalies. And, let's say, the first fire anomaly was recorded near the village of Vasilevka, which is located just east of Zaporozhye. And this, as based on sources, is the substation 750-330. 330 or 750. This station here was hit, and a similar station was hit in western Ukraine, near the village of Strit. Here is the same story turns out, and the same fiery anomaly. In other words, we see for ourselves that the Russian Federation continues to gradually disconnect Ukraine from electricity supply. Let me remind you that in some regions there is no light at all, in some regions, and every day there is, let's say, a blackout according to schedules throughout Ukraine, and of course the next blows to this story, this situation will only worsen. It is difficult to imagine what the situation is, what awaits Ukrainians in the coming winter, but clearly something very bad. Unless, of course, a special military operation ends by this time. Then we are moving to the line of contact. Well, let's go back, let's go to the line of combat contact. It's worth paying attention to the very interesting news that is coming, and has come from the border between Moldova and Ukraine. Today, 1.5 companies of mobilizers were captured on the border while trying to break through Moldova on a massive scale. The border guards, in cooperation with the SBU, the DBR, and a division of the GRU, conducted a special operation on the border with Moldova. Managed to take a large amount. Now these guys are likely to be sent to some. Everyone will be issued, of course, summonses, everyone will be mobilized, and after that, they will most likely be sent to the front line. In general, according to the latest data published here in open sources, there are about 100,000 employees of the shopping mall, 100,000 employees of the shopping mall, and about 136,000 police officers present on the territory of Ukraine. That is, 250, a little less than 250,000 people who are engaged throughout Ukraine. In fact, only one process, the capture and mobilization of people of military age. I remind you also from open sources that during the presidency of Yanukovych, the total number of police officers on the territory of Ukraine did not exceed 30 or 27,000. That is, well, the number of police officers has grown very much during the reign of Poroshenko and Zelensky. It is on this, in principle and in fact, that all power is now being built and held. Well, let's move on to the line of combat contact. There are a lot of important, interesting points, and we will start with you from the Avdiivka direction. From where a large amount of news comes to the Russian units continue to expand the control zone around the next, Novoaleksky. And, of course, the village called Sokol. According to the pro-Ukrainian cartographers, during the fighting, the Russian troops managed to completely clean up this company stronghold. Located north of the village of Sokol and so far the geolocation confirming this confirmation has not been published, but most likely it is. And also the frames are being published. The frames have already begun to be published. Further along the railway from the queue to progress, how Russian units hunt, find and destroy Ukrainian equipment that scurries between settlements, possibly in the process of evacuation, or possibly bringing something, and so on. Well, if we talk about the Novoyelskaya line, then the first shots appeared here, confirming the progress of Russian units. Let me remind you that a month ago the information was published, during the last month. Information was published about the expansion of the control zone by Russian units along the new Alexandrovka line, further north to the Green Field, but this information has not yet found its delegated confirmation. There was also information, not a scandalous as, more than two, in my opinion, about the further advancement of Russian units along the Oshcheretyn-Kalinov line, including the capture of this stronghold. However, this news also did not find its confirmation. And if we talk about the 22nd of June, today we received 2 frames from the fields between the 2 unconfirmed zones. In the first frames, we will be able to observe with you, a Russian tank was published by a non-Ukrainian side, which may have carried a fired defeat on Ukrainian positions with a closed firing position, and literally in a second, this tank was already shot down. Most likely, a blow was struck from somewhere by javelin, or a bucket from Kalinov's side. And later, more shots were published already performed by the 35th Brigade of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. On these frames, on very poor frames, let's say of poor quality, you can observe the movement of a Russian tank, or a Russian one. There is no Russian tank. The Russian Beha is moving towards the forward positions of the Russian army in this direction, in order to carry out, most likely, rotation or the delivery of reinforcements. And now we will return to the map with you and study in more detail how the Russian technology was progressing. We see with you there are no minefields, which suggests that the fields were most likely cleared. The mine map was already more or less clear. And it was more or less clear how to move without coming under fire, or it is a minefield, a minefield. And in the final shots, we see with you how the Russian Beha reaches the forest belt, and the landing takes place, or rather, most likely the delivery of reinforcements, since all this time there are no any. Although that's even how it's kind of like a fire defeat. Well, if we return to the map with you, then the Russian landing party, the landing vehicle moved along this route, crossed the forest field, and then through all the fields to the north, the direction of the Green Field. And here the landing took place directly. That is, let's go back to the map. The movement was like this uncomplicated route, which is confirmed by the turn of controlling the territory and establishing control over these forest shelves. Then we move with you to the end of New York, where the most important news comes from. Again, without geolocation, without confirmation. Today, the pro-Ukrainian resource deep state has updated its maps, indicating that during the fighting over the past day, Russian units managed to significantly expand the control zone opposite Toretsk, New York, and during the fighting, a fierce battle, Russian units managed to completely clean up and establish control over what was left of the once village called Shumy. Moreover, it was even possible to move further west and take a number of strong points. In fact, the line of defense, built by the armed forces of Ukraine since 2000 of the 14th year, has been taken from the first, let's say, Ukrainian company. This territory is now under the control of Russian units, but so far there are no confirming geolocations. But most likely it is. Well, we have to wait a little, and the first shots will begin to appear. But most likely the first shots may even begin to appear from the village of Druzhba and the first assault actions on these streets. Let me remind you that these stunning success and progress Russian units were able to achieve due to the failed rotation of the AFU units between the same Toretsk and Chaz Yar. Well, it's hard to call yourself even a rotation somehow. It was something incomprehensible, and it's unclear what ended up. Let me remind you that at the end of New York, this territory was mainly in the area of responsibility of the defense of the 24th Mechanized Brigade. It was the basis and route, let's say, before the defense in the direction, and a 41st Brigade, which was replaced by the 24th, was in the area of responsibility, in the hours in Yar. The area of responsibility of the hours of Yar Kalinovka. And over the past few weeks, I remind you that we have received practically no news of the Bright direction now. And we said that the situation had stopped there, that it was somehow difficult, the front was frozen, or there were some movements. But we do not yet understand what is happening, but in fact all this time, the last 2 weeks, while the assault actions were conducted in the direction of the same from the citadel in the Eastern Chapel, were conducted fierce fighting with the 41st Brigade. In fact, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, there has been a process of simple grinding of the 41st Brigade. And at the moment when the 41st lost all of its, let's say, combat capability, it was taken to the end. It was in a more or less calm territory, where, well, the Russian army was not expected to attack, since it never attacked here. They brought the 41st here, and the 24th was put in their position here again, in these woods. And when intelligence, the Russian army established this rotation, that almost bloodless units came here. Tired after fighting in the hours of Yar, on an unknown unfamiliar terrain, and the offensive of Russian units began. In fact, from the 41st it finally fell down. And we see with you that this offensive is slowly gaining momentum. And perhaps there is a full initiative on the Russian side. We need to wait a few days to see how the situation will develop further. If you manage to go deeper into the locality itself, then that's all. Then this is the end, and it's possible that everything is as sad as possible. In other words, as we see with you during the rotation, the 41st Brigade lost the positions of the AFU, which had been lined up since 2000 of the 14th year. But what is most interesting, most likely in retaliation, perhaps on the same principle, the 24th, as soon as it was transferred to the Chistov Yar direction, lost even more positions that were held by almost the 41st Brigade, drained of blood. As you can see, we have also updated the map in the area of the Yar clock. To be more precise, we have updated the map between Kalinovka and, let's say, the Chassiar citadel itself. These are the forests along the railway, an industrial zone. On what basis did we do this? 2 posts were published this morning. The first post was published by the 98th Sverskaya, according to which, let's read it. The main part of the neighborhood, under the onslaught of the storming units, came under the control of our troops, that is, Russian troops. Under the control of the APU, only its western part remains, this is the citadel. And the last sentence, the most important one. In recent days, it has been possible to completely clean up the forest area north of the neighborhood. That is, well, here it turns out to be a micro-district itself. Here is the citadel, and here we see a large forest area between Kalinovka and the canal itself. In other words, the idea was, of course, to paint over the entire territory, let's say in such a zone, let's say the disputed territory in connection with the published post. And in principle, we planned to do this, but just before the moment of adjustment. A post was published by a Russian military expert Ribber, who, referring again, most likely to the same sources, perhaps more some details, some insights are available, and reported that it was possible to clean up. But mostly the forest only up to the railway. That is, there is a railway going, let's say, from Artemovsk, Bakhmutev, Chazyar, and now the entire territory to this area is completely cleared. But here it is difficult to say how right the choice is, how correct the data of the 98th are, but one thing is for sure. That here is the area of responsibility of the 41st Brigade, and the territory is completely. The brigade has been completely broken up in the last 2 or 3 weeks. The territory is under full control, or in the pre-cleaning stage. And in general, the 24th here as a whole will not affect anything. There is still an extremely high probability that the 24th will be returned back to Toretsk, in order to somehow restore the lost positions, and so on and so forth. As for the citadel itself, nothing has changed here yet. Ukrainians hold the territory. However, due to the received news about the complete control of the forest, of course, It has already become extremely difficult and unbearable to defend now. Perhaps even Ukrainians in this territory have already been surrounded. Then we are moving with you to the Seversk direction. There are no changes here, the only small adjustment on the map is applied. And Russian sources have published footage of artillery strikes on the positions of heights along this forest belt, that is. And based on this, they updated the map and returned it to control in the forest. Before that, part of the forest belt was in the gray zone, part, at least this corner, is under the control of Russian units. Then we are moving with you to the Kopensky direction, where fierce fighting has resumed and is being conducted along the Svatov-Borov line. Let me remind you that according to the same dictate, this is the next priority, the priority goal of the Russian units. To dissect this Kupiansk grouping into two directions, north and south, by taking Borovaya under control. For the purposes of, let's say, preventing these breakthroughs and this advance, the Ukrainian side has transferred here, let's say, all of its so-called neo-Nazi, let's say so, brigades such as the 67th, and 2 and the 3rd, which is even a banned terrorist organization in the Russian Federation, have been recognized. And now these brigades in this direction are trying to restrain the onslaught of Russian units. A large number of videos were published, including videos of artillery strikes by the 3rd Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on positions and soldiers of the Russian army who moved along the forest belts and stormed, that is, tried to listen to their position on the front edge. Geolocations were recorded at least along this forest path. The progress is insignificant, but in general, as if the most important thing is the vector, namely, how the story develops, and we see with you that there are attempts to improve the tactical situation and access to the gray zone. And it is possible to get as close as possible to the settlements of Grikovka, Druzhevovka, another tire, at least from the south side. And also today, during the night, information was received about a massive artillery strike on Nadia. Perhaps something like artillery training has begun, perhaps in the near future. The assaults of the Russian army along the line of the district town of Persharavneva will try to improve their tactical position along the front edge. As for Volchansk, there are no changes here. No new fabs arrived last night. Today, of course, another video will probably be published in the afternoon, already more accurate. Perhaps from the 3rd time a video of an accurate strike will be published. And for sure they will continue to strike at the settlement of Lipetsk. And perhaps the first 3,000 people will already fly to Volchansk, if it is more accurate, to the citadel in the city center. Although, if according to the last frames that were published from the direction, there is practically nothing left of the citadel itself. And in the near future the 71st Brigade will most likely retreat from this direction. As for the local fighting, there were no local updates in any way. As the battles for the bend of the Volcha River continue. So they continue while you control the forest area in the very south. At least, information about a complete sweep has not been received, including from the North group of troops. And the fighting continues along the main supply route, which they want to restore in the forest between the village of Quiet, and Volchansk itself. Over the past day, several counteroffensive attempts have been made from the height, but all of them were not crowned with success, and, having suffered losses, they retreated along the deep Lipsy. There is a pause here, the offensive has completely stopped. And pay attention, the offensives have completely stopped, and there have not even been attempts by small assault groups to try to check the defense of the Russian army. And so the whole offensive completely stopped and froze after the publication of Fabo in the 3004 2 days in a row. Definitely, the appearance of these cadres on the front line has already changed the trajectory of the Ukrainian command's thoughts. As much as possible, what to do next, and how to further bring the troops, concentrate them in order to strike at the right moment. Now there is again a rethinking of the entire direction, in order to understand how to disperse the troops here in order to strike. First of all, find a weak spot, and then hit this weak spot. Well, as I understand it, based on the fact that any shots of offensive attempts have disappeared at all. The situation here is not developing in the most pleasant and favorable way.